This video is part 5 of Chapter 9, Social Psychology for PSY 110S, the Psychological Sciences. In this section of the chapter, we're going to shift our attention to social cognition or social thinking. So you should kind of think about this as the way in which we as people who are embedded in a social world, how do we think about the behavior of other people? How do we make sense of it? How do we make guesses, categorize people, try to predict their behavior, and so on? So social thinking is concerned with how we judge what other people's attitudes and actions are like, how do we explain those behaviors, and also how we explain our own attitudes and actions in that social space. One theory that is central to our understanding of social cognition is attribution theory. Attribution, just the construct, refers to how we make causal interpretations about other people's actions as well as our own actions. So an attribution is a causal explanation. So if you see somebody doing something like, I'm at the grocery store and I see someone really upset about some other person's behavior and they're acting out. What I do in my head is ask myself a question: why is that person behaving so irrationally? So right away I've decided they're irrational, and then I try to process an explanation. Now I could come to the conclusion that the person is just a mean person, they're an unreasonable person, making attributions about their personality. I could, in contrast, look at the full situation and say there's something going on here that has caused this person to just become overwhelmed. So maybe there was a huge mistake made by another person. Maybe another person has called them some racist name or whatever. I'm just thinking off the top of my head. But maybe it's a conflict that produces an external explanation for their behavior that's very different from the causal explanation that their behavior is due to their personality. Attribution, it often comes with some judgments, some expectations about what people believe to be true. And that leads us to the concept of attitudes. Attitudes are, on the one hand, they're feelings. It's like, how do you feel about X, Y, or Z? How do you feel about this political candidate versus that political candidate? They're also evaluations. So looking at your own attitudes towards objects, people, experiences, whatever they might be, they can be positive or negative evaluations of those things. So if we're thinking about politics, for example, how do you feel about candidate A versus candidate B? And then the question becomes, how does that relate to people's behaviors related to those things, events, or people? Attitudes are essentially opinions. And they're connected to beliefs that we have about the nature of the world. So in this section of the chapter, we're going to look at first at attribution and attribution theory. Then we'll shift and talk about attitudes. There are some broad categories of attributions. Attributions can be internal, and those are decisions where you're deciding that the person's behavior or your own behavior is due to internal dispositional characteristics. In other words, who you are. So if if someone is rude to me, I can look at that person if I don't know them. So let's start with strangers. If a stranger is rude to me, like I'm driving and someone flips me off, and I see that, my pretty much automatic default explanation is that the person is a rude, crude person, that they're just a bad person. That's an internal attribution. Now, an external attribution means looking at the circumstances, looking at the situation that people are in. So go back to the grocery store. You're in line. You're watching a woman with 3 kids. One of them's in the cart having a crying, screaming meltdown, and the mom just snaps at the child and tells them to shut up. Now, you could make the internal attribution that, wow, she's an angry mom, and she is cold, she's uncaring, and she's possibly an abuser. Those are internal attributions. At the same time, having been a mom who's had toddlers have utter and complete meltdowns in the grocery store, I know how frustrating it can be when you're an exhausted parent and your kid has just stomped with both feet on your last nerve. So there, I would actually say it's the kids and the context. This poor woman has had it up to the eyeballs. I really need to, find a way of making her life better. So you can see there's a difference between where you're going to target your attribution. Is it the person or is it the situation? Now, it could be examples of good behaviors. If I see someone be helpful to a neighbor, I can make an internal attribution that that person is a kind and giving person. I could also make an external attribution. What are they trying to get out of this? Are they trying to get that person to do something for them? Trying to get them to give them rewards? Are they being nice so that other people will like them? Those are external attributions. The fundamental attribution error describes, and some textbooks will describe this as a bias as opposed to an error. It's referred to as an error because we can make mistakes when we use this sort of default position. But basically, the fundamental attribution error is when observers tend to over-assume that personality and other internal traits are the dominant explanation for people's behaviors. And this is especially in a Western context. We assume that when people are behaving and we see them behave, there should be a one-to-one connection with their internal attributes. So our default position is to assume that when we see other people doing things, that their internal attributes are to blame. If we have enough evidence and information, we may shift to an external attribution, but our default position is to overestimate dispositional causes, and either miss or ignore situational influences on people's behavior. Now, partly external factors are ignored because we have a tendency to focus our attention on the person whose behavior we're trying to explain. So these external factors tend to be diminished in part because we're so focused on the person. The other part of it is that, especially if we're trying to explain the behavior of strangers, we don't know enough about their behavior over time and across situations to make an accurate judgment about the context. So instead, we go with what feels the most logical, and that would be the internal factors. Now, an extension of attribution theory has to do with something called a belief in a just world. Just world theory was proposed by a psychologist named Lerner, who argued that people have kind of an inborn need to see the world as basically fair. Now, I would argue that that's more common in some cultures than other cultures. It's more extreme in some cultures than other cultures. But basically, in an American context, we do have a tendency to believe that the world has a way of basically people getting what they deserve and deserving what they get. Now, we're less that way about ourselves. We would prefer that the world be more, a little more investigative, finding out exactly what happened. But in our explanations of other people's behaviors, we have a tendency, if a bad thing happens to someone, we look for a way of explaining that bad thing as being, at least in part, due to that person's own behaviors. So let's say that someone gets lung cancer. One of the first questions that some people ask is, why did they smoke? And Lerner would argue that asking that question is a way of saying, this really bad outcome, that wouldn't happen to me because I don't make stupid decisions. So it's sort of a backhanded way of saying, did that person do something stupid that basically justifies them having cancer? That's belief in a just world. So one of the outgrowths of this is something called blaming the victim. When people have really bad outcomes, they have a car crash, or they get assaulted, or they get ill, what we tend to do, we don't want those really bad outcomes for ourselves. We don't like to feel like at random that we, as good people, could suffer really horrible fates. We like to feel like we can avoid that because we're good people. So seeing someone suffer a misfortune that's truly no fault of their own, we try to restore our sense of our own safety and security by blaming the victim. Sometimes we blame victims in a way that is consistent with other kinds of negative attitudes like sexism, racism, etc. So for example, if a person is sexually assaulted, one of the kind of conversations that can emerge is, how was the person dressed? What were they doing? Why were they in that part of town? Why didn't they leave that person who harms them? Why would they date someone who behaves in that way? That becomes the effect that is called blaming the victim, and it's been found to be very powerful in the minds of jurors, especially in sexual assault cases. The logic of the belief in a just world comes from this sort of default belief that good people should have good things happen to them, and good people shouldn't have bad things happen to them. Bad people should have bad things happen to them. Now, from a logic standpoint, we know that this isn't always true, but we'd like it to be. So when bad things happen, we tend to kind of go to this place that says, well, what did they do wrong to get themselves in that situation? How do you override a belief in the just world? You have to carefully encourage people to find more empathy by pointing out, getting people to point to their own experiences of being good people who had random negative events happen to them. And cultivating that kind of empathy can kind of override and correct for the tendency to blame victims based on a belief in a just world. Self-fulfilling prophecies are an example of kind of the mixture of the way attributions and attitudes affect us in our interpretations, but also in terms of our own behaviors. So the self-fulfilling prophecy starts when you have expectations about another person, and that changes your interaction with them in a fundamental way. So, for example, if you believe that your new coworker, somebody drops a nugget of information on you and says, yeah, this new person who's working here is really snobby, and you should watch out. So somebody has given you a nugget of information, and that becomes an expectation of that person's behaviors. Once those expectations in place, if you believe somebody's going to be standoffish and snobby, it changes your behavior toward them. You'll be less warm, less open, less likely to start up a conversation. You may make less eye contact, you may stand with your arms crossed. All of those things elicit basically snobby behavior from that other person. And once that snobby behavior comes from that other person, basically your beliefs are confirmed. And the cold distance that you have created actually brings coldness and distance from that other person. Now, your authors give the example of you predict that someone's going to be uncooperative. That may shape your behavior in the direction of being somewhat more hostile and uncooperative yourself in your interactions with that person. That then leads that person, because you're being hostile, they may respond in kind with uncooperativeness, thus confirming your expectations. The person may not really, in terms of internal traits, be an uncooperative person. At the same time, though, what you've done is set them up so that their behavior will fit what you expect. So once your expectations are confirmed, you're going to think that person is that way. And you'll make attributions about their future behavior related to that. Researchers have found routinely that, based on our attitudes, if we have a prediction about a person based on their social grouping, so for example, I do research on attitudes towards people with serious mental illnesses like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. And one common expectation is that people with these kinds of disorders are prone to violence. So if a person has that expectation and they interact with someone who they find out has one of these mental illnesses, their pre-existing attitude predicting violence or dangerousness from such a person may encourage them to be fearful, anxious in their interactions. They may, avoid connecting with that person. They may give them a really wide berth. That can make people really anxious. When someone acts in relation to you like you're a threat, it makes you anxious. It makes you fearful. So in these interactions, someone could actually sort of preemptively behave in a hostile manner towards someone with the mental illness because they expect that that person is going to be hostile. So once they've behaved in a hostile way toward them, they may get it back. Because if you're being attacked, the most likely response is for you to attack yourself in some way. So the self-fulfilling prophecy is an interactive process where you have expectations, beliefs, attitudes about another person. That alters your behavior, and it will, in effect, pull the expected behavior from the other person, and therefore confirming your expectations. So this is sort of the ugly little cycle that can take place when you have prejudicial attitudes towards a particular group and you've classified a new person into that group. Your own behavior may actually bring out those expectations in the person you're with. So very problematic. Another aspect of this is something called the actor-observer bias. And it's connected to the fundamental attribution error and a little more loosely to things like self-fulfilling prophecies. When we are kind of explaining our own behaviors, when we're explaining our own experiences, we have a tendency to provide ourselves with self-explanations that are consistent with a basically positive self-esteem. So the little comic here off to your right, it says, "My genetics is the cause of my weight gain. Yours is ice cream." That's essentially a joke for how the actor-observer bias works. As if we're explaining our own choices, our attention is typically focused externally, like on the situation. With others, when we're explaining other people's behaviors, our focus is on them. So we tend to focus on them as people, their personalities, their traits, their dispositions. So the other part of it, it's not just attentional. It's also the fact that we don't want to come to conclusions that will harm our self-image either. And that shifts us to the next kind of bias, which is called the self-serving bias. These two biases, the actor-observer effect and the self-serving bias, they work hand in hand, and they're difficult to separate. The self-serving bias is the tendency to make attributions that allow you to see yourself in a good light. So let's say you had a bad score on an exam, a score that you're not happy with. The tendency is for you to explain that bad grade in a way that protects your image of yourself. So you explain it as the teacher wasn't clear, the teacher was terrible, the material was too hard, it wasn't presented in a way that was appropriate, whatever. It's not about you or your abilities, your natural abilities. You may explain it not so much blaming other people as looking at the broader situation. I was too tired, I had gotten a cold. Those are also self-serving explanations. The tendency is when our outcomes are good, when we do something right, we do something wonderful, our tendency is to overestimate the degree to which we as people are responsible for that good outcome. So you get a good grade on the test, it's because you're smart and you work very hard. When your outcomes are negative, so you get a bad grade on a test, your tendency is to really focus in on the situational aspects as opposed to you being not very smart or not working hard. It's about the situation. You were sick or the teacher was terrible. The self-serving bias is a part of the actor-observer bias because it's like a tweak of it. So which type, dispositional or situational, of attribution you make is going to be dependent on whether or not the outcome that you're trying to explain is positive or negative for you. So that also kicks into the actor-observer bias, where you are determining which type of attribution, internal or external, to make. With ourselves, good outcomes are often explained dispositionally. Bad outcomes are explained situationally. The reverse tends to be true for attributions about other people. So if someone else fails, it's because of something they did or who they are. If something good happens to someone, particularly if we don't like them, we may explain it away. But if it's neutral, we may put it in a more situational space. This bias basically is self-protective. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's self-protective. It makes us feel a little bit better than average most of the time. So this has a protective function. Clearly, for people with depressive illnesses, when they are very depressed, the self-serving bias doesn't work. We tend to explain away as situational our successes and over-own our failures. Another kind of cognitive bias, or set of cognitive biases, is a tendency to believe that the things we think are true, most people think they're true. That's called the false consensus effect. So you're overestimating how common your opinions and behaviors are. If you like a certain kind of music, you may overestimate how many other people like that kind of music, for example. Or if you like a particular political candidate, you may think that far more people than actually like that candidate actually do. The false uniqueness effect is, in a way, the opposite. It's a tendency to underestimate how common some of your abilities are. So for most of us, we're pretty average in a lot of ways and not all that special. but we like to feel a little more special, a little above average. So go back to that other bias, the self-serving bias. The false uniqueness effect is actually just an extension of the self-serving bias. We want to feel a little special, and like we're really, really good. So if you are good at something, it's more likely that you're okay at something, but not especially brilliant. So we tend to inflate the degree to which our actual abilities to perform are unique. For both of these, they have a self-esteem maintenance effect. We like to feel like our beliefs and attitudes and values are shared by lots of people. It makes us feel good. At the same time, where our performance is concerned, we like to feel that we're just a little better than everybody else, and that's where false uniqueness comes in. Both of these serve the purpose of bolstering our sense of self-esteem so that we feel better about ourselves than we would otherwise. Now, I gave you a working definition of attitudes earlier. Attitudes are evaluative reactions at their base. They're feelings. They're feelings of either positivity or negativity toward anything you can think about, a thing, an event, a person, whatever. So the assumption that attitude theorists make is that attitudes should predict behavior. They should be a guide to how we act. When is this going to happen? It's most likely to occur when our attitudes are fairly clear and very strong, and when we are primed to be very aware of what our attitudes are. Finally, attitudes are predictive of actions when the situational factors are weak. So if you think about this thing about voting, if you have an attitude that you feel strongly about a particular candidate, you're most likely to vote for that candidate. In situations where you're, like, I'm thinking of local political races, like judges, if you're made consciously aware of what your feelings are about particular parties or candidates, you're more likely then to follow those attitudes. And if there are limitations on outside influences that would impact your vote. That's why our polling places, there are limitations on the ability for people to try and persuade you at the polling place. There are a number of theories of attitudes and attitude change that are fairly pivotal in social psychology. We're going to talk about each one briefly. The first one is cognitive dissonance theory, and that's proposed by Festinger. And then it was challenged by self-perception theory. In actuality, the two combine really nicely to explain different aspects of attitude formation and change. And then finally, role-playing effects. We'll talk about Zimbardo's infamous research. So starting with cognitive dissonance, in the original study, the participants are brought in and they're asked to complete a devastatingly boring task. After an hour of having to perform this super boring task, the experimenter asks the person to do something sketchy. So essentially, the participants were asked to tell, the setup is, we're having a lot of trouble getting people to participate. The rumor's out that the task is awful. So we're really having trouble. Could you do me a favor and talk to the next person and tell them how great it was? Now there are two separate groups, and we'll come back to that. One group of participants is told, and essentially, remember what they're doing. They're being asked to lie. So that's very self-relevant. When someone asks you to lie to another person, that's relevant to your self-image. Most of the time, we don't like to see ourselves as liars. So Festinger's asking them to lie. In exchange for lying, half the participants were paid $1. Now, this was the 50s. That would get you probably 4 drinks out of a vending machine. Participants in the other group were paid $20. Now, even today, if somebody handed you $20, you'd be pretty happy about that. You could do a lot. But back then, in the 50s, that was a lot of money for a college student. So you have either a low external explanation, that's the $1, or a strong external explanation. So there are multiple layers to this study. The experimenter asks the student to tell them the task was fun. That's a lie. They were asked to take either $1 or $20. The $1 is a weak external motivator. So if the person, the participant, if they're in their own head saying, why do I lie to another unsuspecting student, and they have to come up with an attribution to explain that. Why did I do that? If they're only paid $1, $1's not enough. So they need to make an adjustment to their attitude toward the task. So the easiest way to eliminate how uncomfortable they feel with lying is to say, yeah, the task wasn't that bad. So they're adjusting. They're not turning it from a totally negative attitude toward the task to a positive one. They're just toning it down a little. For the students paid $20, though, if they're looking at themselves in the mirror and saying, why did I lie? They would kind of laugh and say, because you paid me $20. And when they're asked, what do you think about the task? Like, it was deadly boring. So their attitude toward the task doesn't change. So remember, we're talking here about how do attributions explaining our own behaviors impact our attitudes. Basically, if you're forced into a dissonant situation where you know the task is horrible, but you've just told a lie to another person that the task wasn't so bad, what do you do with that? If you can't find a solid, good explanation for your behavior that's external, then you're going to change your attitude, at least somewhat. So the idea with cognitive dissonance theory is that people are going to adjust their attitudes to reduce the discomfort that's caused by inconsistencies between what they feel, their attitudes, and what they've done. So just to review here, why did the participants paid only $1 change their attitude toward the task more than participants paid $20? The people who were given $1 were given what's called an insufficient external justification for their immoral act. So there's inconsistency there between their actions, saying the experiment was interesting when it wasn't, and their attitudes. They actually believe the task was pretty boring, but they don't have a sufficient external justification for lying. So they need to shift their attitude. The task wasn't that bad. To reduce the consistency, they're going to make that adjustment. That inconsistency results in that change in attitude reduces the dissonance that you experience. Now, Bem's self-perception theory, he wasn't a big fan of cognitive dissonance theory. He was a behavioral psychologist, and he argued that, if people watch the Festinger setup, they could easily predict what was going to happen. So he didn't believe it was any sort of internal state of cognitive dissonance that was causing this stuff to occur. So he contended that we make inferences by examining our behavior in the context. We don't necessarily change our attitudes, but rather we use our what we've done and what we see in our own behavior to make inferences about what our attitudes must be. Now, I included a picture here of a roller coaster with some people riding it. And judging from their facial expressions, some of them are enjoying it and some of them are not. Let's say you've never been on a roller coaster and you take your first roller coaster ride and you get off and someone asks you, how was it? Bem argues you will reflect on your own behavior while on the roller coaster to determine whether you liked it or not. If you said you were screaming and you were terrified and no, you don't like it, you've made the inference based on the experience you've just had. If you remember yourself smiling and screaming in joy and exhilaration, you're likely to form a positive attitude. Now, when we compare these two theories, it's important that while Bem was really challenging the concept of cognitive dissonance, as it turns out, both theories are useful because they explain somewhat different phenomenon. Cognitive dissonance theory is a better explanation when we are caught in those kinds of situations where our attitudes and our actions are inconsistent. This is particularly the case when we've behaved in a way that is counter to our sense of ourselves as good, decent, kind human beings. So if I've been rude to someone, that causes cognitive dissonance because I basically see myself as a polite person, as a kind person. So I need to reduce that opinion or that feeling of dissonance. When it's related to attitudes, when we don't have a sufficient situational explanation, we may shift our opinions under those circumstances. Self-perception theory is much better at explaining situations where we don't really know how we feel. So when our attitudes are not well defined, where they're not clear. So it's a better explanation of novel situations, like your first experience with a particular food or drink, your first experience on a date, something that's not well formed. So like if you go out on a date with a person the first time and someone asks you, so do you like them? And you reflect back on your behavior during the date and you say to yourself, I was bored. I wasn't smiling a lot. No, I don't like them. If instead you were smiling a lot, you didn't want the date to end, you enjoyed the stories that the other person told, you may then say, yes, I like them. So attitudes can be inferred from actions when it's not clear going in what our attitudes were. We're going to wrap up with looking at social roles and how social roles can shape behavior. A social role is a way of kind of constraining a social position by defining specifically what kind of behaviors are supposed to go with it. The type of social roles that are being described here are roles that are relatively well defined, and they provide within a cultural context basically a description of behaviors that you're supposed to engage in when you're in that particular role. So think about roles of people in your life. You know, what's a teacher and what are teachers supposed to do? What's a student? What's a student supposed to do? What's a politician? What's a politician supposed to do? Etc., etc. These are all social patterns and social roles. Zimbardo, Philip Zimbardo, conducted a famous study. I don't think it's fair to call it an experiment. It was more like a laboratory observational study where, and it's a notorious piece of research like Milgram's, where Zimbardo's behaviors were called into question on ethical grounds and a variety of other things that we'll talk about in a bit. But basically what Zimbardo did was he set up a fake jail in the basement of the psychology building at Stanford, and then he put out an advertisement in the paper asking for volunteers. So these were college-age students, all males, to participate in this study, where they were, half of them, they were randomly assigned, half of them were fake arrested and brought into the jail. The other half were assigned the role of being prison guards. They were provided with a base uniform, some of the trappings of the job, and then they were set up. Before the study started, the volunteers, the people who signed up, were given some tests and to assess their emotional stability, and the people scoring the highest on those tests were accepted as participants, and then they were randomly assigned the roles of either prisoner or prison guard. Now, why a prison study? Zimbardo, like Milgram, was really interested in trying to understand the way in which situations could lead to people behaving in specific ways. And, he talked a lot about how the power of the situation could really control what people do. And the participants, particularly under the influence of the man pictured on the right-hand side of your screen, he got into this, and at first he was like pretty bored. He was 19 years old, and it's like, I'm a participant in this study. I've been assigned to be a guard, and right now everybody's just sort of hanging out. And he was like, okay, I'm going to be the prison guard that I've just seen in Hollywood in the movies. So he adopted a kind of pseudo-Southern accent and played the role of the meanest, most hostile, intimidating prison guard he could think of. And a few of the other guards also followed suit. Some of them just kind of stood back and took on the role of being kind of a gopher, but they didn't argue against it. They didn't stop him from doing it. As a result, the role-playing quickly became reality. Some of the prisoners started to shut down. Some of them pushed back, but then, the guards, once they got into their roles, they had them wear humiliating clothing. They took away their underwear, made them wear smocks, made them do demeaning punishments, like doing push-ups and without their undergarments on, making them kiss each other, all kinds of weird, degrading things. None of the guards actually got violent, but the question arose really quickly of whether that was going to be the case. Some of the prisoners, even though everybody knew it was a study, and Zimbardo assumed that these participants knew that they could leave at any time, some of them really got kind of captivated by their role of being trapped in this situation, that they were being treated horribly. And some of them overplayed that role of having emotional breakdowns. Some of them really were in actual distress. Fairly quickly, Zimbardo had to shut the study down, but it wasn't until his then fiancée confronted him about just how distressing the behavior of both the prisoner and guard role players was. She was very concerned that the prisoners were going to get violent and someone was going to get hurt, or that the guards were going to get violent and hurt the prisoners. She was also concerned that the prisoners were being traumatized by the experience. So Zimbardo called it to a halt. Now, there are lots and lots of criticisms of the study. Like Milgram's work, there were not formal ethics boards in place at that time that were used routinely. And Zimbardo was kind of notorious for doing edgy studies that were kind of on the edge of being ethically appropriate. One of the methodological difficulties with the study was that it wasn't clear how much of the participants' behaviors was due strictly to the acceptance of these situational roles, or whether it was really shaped by Zimbardo's own behavior. Zimbardo making a critical methodological error, and his research partner, they were involved. Basically Zimbardo was the warden of the prison, or the chief of police. And, the guards would interact with him. He would interact giving direction. So in some ways, you have this demand characteristic where Zimbardo is essentially directing the behaviors of the participants. Now, he didn't tell the guards what to do, but he didn't tell them what not to do either. He shouldn't have been involved at all. If he was the researcher, he shouldn't have been, interacting with them in any way, shape, or form. So that's problematic. It is true that despite the fact that many people interpreted the study that if I put you in a role, you're going to go rogue, only a few of the guards were overtly abusive. Some of them were passive and didn't make complaints. But there wasn't a lot of evidence that they challenged the behaviors of the abusive guards. The abusive guards were kind of allowed to do what they wanted to do. A final criticism was that you weren't really looking at a representative sample. This was an all-male population. They were young. They were overwhelming. They were all, in the original study, white. And they were all attending, a pretty prestigious institution. So not representative. And as some of the participants actually said, they made choices about their behavior that were based on images that they'd seen in the media. Now, on the one hand, that actually proves Zimbardo's point. If we think we know what the role is, we're going to shape our behavior to fit that, and then act it out. And that can shape our interactions with other people to suit. On the other hand, you could criticize Zimbardo by saying, yeah, he got exactly what he wanted. This wasn't naturalistic behavior. He set it up in such a way that these outcomes would arise. And that really challenges the findings. Now, your authors present to you a quote-unquote replication. And I'm putting it in quotation marks because it was a TV show. In a way, it was a reality TV show. So Haslam and Riker, with the BBC in England, did a recreation of the Stanford Prison study. They used ethical procedures to conduct the study, and it was filmed. Now, everybody knew it was being filmed, so I want you to take that into consideration, because that, just like Zimbardo's setup, that creates demand characteristics. Okay, so put that to the side. Male volunteers were recruited. They were randomly assigned to be either guards or prisoners, and they were put into a fake prison setting. Unlike Zimbardo, Haslam and Riker were not involved in any way interacting with the participants. They didn't give any instructions to control the prisoners, although Zimbardo did make some suggestions that guards were to maintain order and discipline, and that's all. The guards in the TV show, as your authors put it, failed to identify with their role and were reluctant to behave in an authoritarian way. The prisoners formed a cohesive group identity, and they rebelled after 6 days. Now, in some ways, this quote-unquote replication does challenge the findings that Zimbardo reported, that the nature of the role would dictate the behavior. But in this case, the replication showed the reverse. The guards weren't becoming hostile, controlling authoritarians. Instead, the prisoners adopted a role of being rabble-rousers and rebels who needed to break out. Now, they were following a role structure very common in popular media of being unjustly imprisoned. You need to form an alliance and you need to fight the authority figures and break out, right? So in a way, it's exactly the same kind of thing that Zimbardo found. And I would argue it's not really research when it's TV. So I'm not dismissing it. They make a great point, and it's an interesting exploration. And that concludes my coverage of Chapter 9.